Hello, friends. I have another exciting game to share with you all today. This is a game I played last night on stream, and it's really me taking advantage of the fact that my opponent did not address his king safety, did not castle very early on, and I really took advantage of that. So let's check out this game. This is another e4, e5 game from me. I love playing the Italian game, and my opponent opts for the Philidor defense, which is a bit passive. It does block this bishop from coming outside the pawn chain, and so they're going to have to play bishop to e7, which does take over these dark squares, preventing me from taking advantage over g5, and they go h6 just for good measure, really not allowing me to attack f7 with any like knight g5 business. But also interestingly, they bring the knight to d7, which is another passive point, blocking this bishop a little bit. And I just simply castle, focusing on my development. They bring the knight out, and it looks like they're also ready to castle, but instead, they bring their knight back to f8, rerouting this knight, which, in my opinion, is ideally placed on c6, where instead they have a pawn. But this move does allow for the bishop to come out if they want to, and this knight's probably going to come somewhere else, and again, maintain the option of castling kingside. I just took the bishop back, anticipating this d5 central expansion. And yeah, here we see the point behind h6, maybe not necessarily taking g5, but just advancing this pawn and basically looking for g4. So the intention is very clear. They want to use the king side to attack me and open up a file for the rook, and they're not going to be castling kingside. So in anticipation over g4, I bring the knight back, which is directly controlling g4 with the knight, but also opening up the diagonal for my queen. So really just preventing g4 from happening. Now the knight does develop to g6, and I just want to expand in the center. I've castled. My rook is on the e file. Their king is still in the center. They have not yet castled, and we just want to open things up. So they get the queen off the d file and onto this diagonal, anticipating perhaps that it will open up eventually. And they want to kind of decrease any chances of a queen trade. So they get off the d file where my queen is, and they really want to attack my king. So I just continue with opening the center. D takes E and D takes E. So now here I develop the queen, putting some pressure on this knight, and also kind of looking at f7 a little bit. So this knight is pinned. So this knight gets a really nice outpost square on f4, hunkered down by these two pawns, and I just decide to take this, getting my last piece off the back rank, and now we have our rooks connected. I'm fully developed, and they take with the g pawn, which makes sense if they want to use the open g file for their rook. And yeah, I just bring the last piece into the game. We got both rooks on the d and e file, very centralized, and we're kind of cutting off the d file a little bit from the king. So I would expect a good plan for black is to get this last piece out, go to d7, block the d file, and get ready to castle queenside. That seems very logical to me. But yeah, rook to g file makes sense. And I just want to reroute this knight. Not entirely sure what I want to do or where I want to go, but I realize this pawn is just completely boxing out this knight. And yeah, we're just simply rerouting it for now. And I play c3, just trying to take over, I don't know, d4. Maybe bishop here is also an idea that they have. I'm not entirely sure if this is too important, but yeah, I'm thinking if maybe I break through with g3 or something, if we try to attack this f pawn, try to get at this e5 pawn, I can take over the d4 square. Would be a nice place for my knight at some point. And yeah, here instead of developing to block the d file with their bishop, they go for this bishop trade, which I think is very peculiar. So I don't really see how they plan on castling ever after this. I simply just take on e6, pawn takes, and now they have this very weak pawn duo in the center. These double pawns, the king is not going to be castling unless they plan on going knight d7, which is a very backwards move and also gives me ways of check, right, to the king and maybe winning material, but also this king's just going to be a sitting duck. So bishop e6, very peculiar to say the least. Here the queen was now attacking my b2 pawn after my bishop took, so I'm just simply protecting my pawns. And here the king develops, I guess, connects the rooks, and yeah, they will not be castling. And the king here is on f7, opposite of my queen, and honestly just very exposed. There are some pieces around, but this king is actually very weak here, and I take full advantage of this. I have all my pieces developed. We've got both knights on the king side, and I just simply go straight for it. I go knight takes f4, just sacrificing the piece for the 2 pawns. I am undoubling their pawns, but I'm mostly just focused on the king here. So after pawn takes, I just recapture this pawn immediately, getting the 2 pawns for the knight, and getting the queen opposite of the king, and we're threatening e5, which is going to win back the knight, and definitely taking the initiative on this king. So the knight is saved by bringing the king off of the f file. E5 hits anyways, so the knight has to go somewhere. Where exactly they go, they have to keep in mind that the knight is controlling this queen g4 check. There's also like queen g3 check. There's also going to be queen e4 check options. Lots of opportunities to get at this king here after this knight moves. So the knight decides to go back to h7, and I just continue the attack. I notice this bishop is hanging, and I want to get my queen to this 7th. So rook here is a very powerful move, not only attacking a hanging bishop, but if the bishop were to move, then I have access to f7 with the queen check, which is devastating, forcing the king deeper into my position where it will probably be checkmated. Not to mention, I'll be winning back material at the least. So instead of moving the bishop is protected by the other rook, so the last piece of black gets into the game, although a very passive role. And I bring in the knight. So now the queen is working with the knight on the dark squares, and this is the huge threat. Just queen takes simply is going to be lights out. Like I said, at least winning back the material of the knight, but even more so just checkmating the king in the center of the board. So here my opponent has to defend h6. Queen h6 is too strong of a threat. Again, if they move the bishop to block, then the queen gets to f7, and that's actually just checkmate. So instead of blocking, what else can they do? They have to play knight to g5. Now, the knight here was guarding this f6 square. Notice the knight not only attacking h6, but is also taking more control over f6, along with the queen and the pawn. So right now, we're trying to fight for these dark squares. And so black has to prioritize defense over h6, but in doing so gives up some control over f6. Now the bishop is still protecting f6, so queen f6 is not possible now, but simply just sacrificing the rook at this point, taking that bishop and saying if you take back, then queen f6 is going to be lights out, followed by queen takes h6, not even interested in the rook getting the material back, but that's just a mate in 2 threat. So they cannot take here. Instead, they really have to guard f6 now. So they play rook over, attacking the queen, guarding f6, and if I save the queen, then I'm going to lose the rook next. So that was not part of the intention of sacrificing the rook. I really wanted queen f6 check. So here I had to think on the spot, and luckily I was able to improvise with a very nice rook takes e6 check. So if rook takes, then simply queen takes rook. And remember, this knight has a very important job of guarding h6. So if knight takes, then queen takes h6, and follow that with queen to h7 with the king on f5, that's going to lead to checkmate very quick. So what else can they do? Probably best is to bring the king back to g7. And then I'm not entirely sure. I guess just simply rook to f6. And not only have I won the material back, but I just am going to be completely crushing this king. Very weak. And yeah, that should be definitely more than enough to win the game. But instead of bringing the king back, which is probably their best move, they take here. But again, their options are very limited at this point, and they're all very, very poor. So yeah, queen takes now is available. The king is forced here. And like I said earlier, queen h7 was just going to be the fastest mate. But in the game, I just did the knight check, which forces the king onto the e file where the rook is lying in wait for nasty discovery. So the king has two options here: take the pawn or go to e4. They just take the pawn, and now knight to c4 is a discovered double check and a queen fork. And yeah, simply moving to the d file, instead of taking the queen with check, I have the very pretty rook to e5 checkmate. So this was a fun game. Definitely wanted to share this with you guys. I really liked the knight sacrifice and the rook sacrifice, and then having to improvise on the spot, finding rook takes e6. Definitely driving home the point that the king was so weak here in the center. And hopefully, if my opponent's watching this, I would advise definitely try to castle your king. Don't leave it in the center, where I'm going to try to tear apart the position and do so in a nice style like this. So, yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy this, learn something from it, and I'll see you guys next time.